Thanksgiving and football have been intertwined in American culture for well over a century, but few recall that one of the most tragic disasters in college football history occurred on that very holiday in the year 1900. The annual big game between Stanford University and the University of California, Berkeley was an intense rivalry that had captivated the West Coast since 1892. Played in San Francisco, the 1900 edition of the contest was expected to be one of the grandest yet. Instead, it became a scene of unimaginable horror. I frequently use real newspaper headlines and articles as sources for these videos. Just be aware that the headlines and quotes in this video are rather gruesome. Let's begin. By 1900, the big game between Cal and Stanford had firmly established itself as the premier sporting event in California. That year's contest was to be played at Recreation Park in the Mission District of San Francisco, a venue that struggled to accommodate the ever increasing number of spectators. The Mission District at the time was a working class neighborhood packed with Irish and German families. The game had outgrown the facilities, but the fervor of the fans was undeterred. An estimated 19,000 ticketed attendees, the largest crowd ever gathered for a sporting event west of the Mississippi, poured into the stadium that morning, brimming with anticipation for the annual showdown. However, thousands more who could not afford the $1 ticket or simply arrived too late searched for alternative ways to see the game. Many turned to the newly built San Francisco and Pacific Glass Works factory, located just across from the stadium. The factory, which was under construction, had fired up its furnaces to verify their operation. The rooftop of the factory, which overlooked the field, became an irresistible perch for hundreds of eager spectators seeking an unobstructed view of the game. Throngs of people made their way onto the glass factory's corrugated iron roof. The factory's superintendent, James Davis, had been forewarned about the potential risks of people climbing onto the building. He had even been offered 6 complimentary tickets to ensure the roof remained clear. Yet accounts suggest that either through neglect or outright corruption, some factory workers allowed or even charged spectators for access to the rooftop. By game time, hundreds of spectators, mostly young boys and teenagers, had crowded onto the roof, with many gathering on the ventilator section, a strip of corrugated iron about 72 feet long and 8 feet wide. What these eager fans didn't realize was the deadly trap they'd walked into. Below them, the factory's furnace had been stoked for over a week, reaching temperatures of 3,000 degrees as the plant prepared to begin operation. The thin roof they stood upon was never designed to hold any weight beyond its own. The San Francisco Examiner from Friday, November 30th, 1900, tells us what happened next. The crowd which had gathered on the roof of the south building found the ventilator a fine thing to climb upon or lean against. They made their way to it by 2s and 3s and 10s, and were intently watching the game when, without a creak or a tremor or any sign of warning, the entire roof of the ventilator collapsed from the middle, just as the trap of a gallows collapses. And there below the gaping hole roared the hell pot furnaces. There was no chance to reach out for safety. Those on the ventilator were dropped with the suddenness of thought. The ventilator was not built to hold weight. Its supports were merely intended to hold it in place against the strain of the elements, and the weight of the crowd which fell was so great that it snapped an 8 by 12-inch stringer over the retorts, cracked a corner of one of the furnaces, bent a heavy bar of iron set as a supporting arm for the flaming engines of science, and started the flaming oil to spurting through the testing apertures. 45 feet is a fearful fall in itself. The floors of the glassworks are of brick, so even those who fell clear of the superheated retorts had small chance to escape maiming or other injury, and the moaning of the many bruises and bleeding men and boys was at once added to the shrieks of the dying. The newspapers in those days did not mince words. The San Francisco Chronicle of November 30th, 1900 tells us what happened during the game. The game was well underway when there was a crash. For a moment, the people in the grandstands lost their interest in the contest and necks were craned toward the roof of the glassworks. Just at that moment, the Californians were making inroads on the Stanford line of defense. "It's a job!" cried someone, believing it to be a premeditated scheme to confuse the lads from across the bay. The crowd took it up, and in an instant all eyes were again centered on the gridiron. Still, there was excitement on the roof. People were hurrying to and fro, and in a short time the roof was bare. About this time, Lieutenant Anderson of the 17th Street Police Station appeared and ordered all available policemen to the scene of the disaster. Those who fell onto the factory floor suffered broken bones and devastating injuries, but the ones who landed atop the inferno faced an unspeakable fate. Their bodies ignited upon impact as factory workers desperately tried to pull them free. The Examiner included an illustration to help with understanding what had happened. The furnaces, or retorts technically, were 3,000 degrees within and an estimated temperature of 500 degrees on the top where people landed. Charles Yachts, defined as an oven man, in a Chronicle article, gave an eyewitness account. "I first heard the rafters crack, and then bodies began to drop around me. Several falling came within a hair's breadth of crushing me, and I had to seek safety in another part of the building. I soon realized that something had to be done to save the wounded, and especially to rescue 2 men who had fallen on top of the oven and were rapidly roasting to death. The oven was white hot, and the contortions of the injured men as they tried to pull themselves away from the fire was a sight which can never be effaced from my memory. Others soon arrived, and with their assistance I succeeded in removing the 2 men. Those killed either struck the heavy bands that surrounded the oven or had their lives crushed out beneath the bodies of the other victims. Many succeeded in staying their fall for a moment by holding onto the broken beams. But before they could be rescued, they were obliged to let go their hold and fall upon those who had preceded them. The shrieks of the wounded and the groans of the dying were frightful to hear." The game went on as all this was happening, as if in another completely different world. The game was settled in the final minutes by a single score, the first successful field goal in the history of the big game. Stanford won 5-0. Newspaper accounts of the game included nothing of the disaster. A game story from the Chronicle included a poem that ended with this stanza, "And the pretty girl in the grandstand said, 'Oh, Jack, I'm glad I came. Is the side that kills the other first the side that wins the game?'" A game story from the Oakland Inquirer included a section labeled "Crowd Well Handled" that stated, "The big crowd which attended the game was exceedingly well handled, the seating arrangements being as perfect as they could be under the circumstances. The usual complaint about the overselling of the seats was conspicuous by its absence." While there was a parade after the game, the Examiner states that the atmosphere was somewhat subdued. The solemnity of the accident seemed to have silenced the college yell. Occasionally, a buoyant youth of such spirit as nothing can subdue on a college occasion broke out into a yell or attempted some bit of hilarity through a megaphone. But the crowd never broke into a demonstration. Newsboys, crying the latest figures of the dead and wounded, hurried along the outer edge of the collegiate throngs, and their shrill voices seemed to have all the attention. Plainly, the college people felt the sentiment of gloom and were governed by it. And the team is celebrated with a banquet, which is typical, but elsewhere the hospitals and the morgues overflowed. Newspaper accounts of the tragedy were horrifying. James Moseley was one of the few who escaped uninjured. He was among the last to fall and landed upon a heap of the others. "We had no warning of the coming disaster," said Moseley as he walked away from the scene of the accident. "The first break must have occurred some little distance back of me, for I heard a cry and felt the roof giving way. The next thing I knew, I was plunging through the air. I landed feet first in the midst of 12 or 15 others. Except for the shock and a slight wrench of the left ankle, I am uninjured." One middle-aged man cried out repeatedly for his boy. The father was on the roof with the little fellow, and they both had fallen. "Please tell me if my boy is alive," he asked beseechingly. I told him that the son was saved, and he seemed satisfied. A few minutes later, the father was taken away in an ambulance, and the boy was stretched out on the floor among the unknown dead. T.J. Parker was a fireman aiding in removing the dead and wounded from the scene when he recognized the blood-covered face of one of the sufferers, his own son. Francis Joseph Parker is the name of the injured boy. He was taken to the city and county hospital, where it was found that his skull was fractured and right arm broken. He suffers from internal injuries and will probably die. When William Eckfeldt, a machinist, recognized his son among the victims, he fell unconscious and had to be carried away. Funerals were held in San Francisco over the next few days, and reporting included this somber piece from the Examiner on December 3rd, 1900. 11 caskets, half hidden in floral pieces bestowed by friends in loving memory, a last-minute tribute to the dead, were carried to the grave yesterday. All were victims of the Thanksgiving Day disaster. 9 were mere children, gay, jolly schoolboys who had been the life and brightness of the homes from which they were taken so suddenly. One particularly pathetic incident occurred out in the Mission, showing how general is the sorrow wrought by the gasworks' falling roof. The funeral services had been read over the casket which held the body of little 11-year-old Edgar Flavin. A dozen of the dead boy's former playmates had tenderly carried the body from the house, and the journey to Laurel Hill had begun. Before a block was passed, another little casket containing the body of Willie Eckfeldt was carried from another desolated home, and side by side the 2 funeral processions continued out into the cemetery. The families were unacquainted, but the common bond of a mutual sorrow seemed to have drawn them together. There was an earlier incident at the 1897 big game that should have served as some kind of warning. In 1897, the roof of the structure built to serve as the grandstand for the game collapsed when crowds climbed on top of one section. The collapse injured several people, but didn't kill anyone. As the game progressed, men and boys climbed up the supports of the roof to a point of advantage above. Neither the police nor the managers warned them off, and just as the game was about to close, there were between 40 and 50 boys on the roof over the University Club section. An exciting play on the field caught the attention of everyone within the enclosure. The people in the section rose to their feet, and those on the roof rushed forward in eagerness not to lose a view of the game. In a moment, there was a crash, and the men on the roof were shot down into the crowd beneath. The heels of the falling men and boys struck the faces of those who by impulse looked up to learn the cause of the accident. The uprights of the roof had spread and broken under the weight, and the whole mass had fallen. J.C. Weir, the contractor in charge of the construction of the stand, stated, "The accident was due entirely to those who had the management of the game. If they had not sold more tickets than there was room for spectators, there would have been no necessity for people to have climbed up on the temporary roof. The entire seating capacity, including the grandstand and 1,600 feet of temporary bleachers, was not more than 10,000. There were at least 15,000 people crowded into the grounds." You'd have thought this was a warning sign from God if no one else, but those signs obviously went unheeded. Fingers were pointed in every which way in the aftermath, searching for whom to blame. A coroner's inquest was formed to assign blame for the tragedy. The factory superintendent, James Davis, had been forewarned about the potential risks of people climbing onto the building. Davis insisted his men had done everything possible to keep out the crowd, and denied testimony that his workers had offered entrance to the roof for a fee. Yet accounts suggest that either through neglect or outright corruption, some factory workers allowed or even charged spectators for access to the rooftop. The police were blamed for not assigning enough officers to assist with crowd control. On December 6, 1900, 1 week after the tragedy occurred, the coroner's jury found no one responsible for the incident. The jury contemplated their verdict for 20 minutes. The verdict stated, We find that death was caused by the breaking of the roof over the furnace house of the San Francisco Glassworks. And we further find that Dante Monaco had no business there, and that he was there against the wish and attempted resistance of the superintendent of the works, that no one can be held responsible for his death other than himself, and that his death was accidental. Judge Barry, acting coroner, approved the verdict and said that it agreed with his own sentiments. The same verdict was applied to 17 other cases, as Dante Monaco was only one of the victims. And keep in mind, several of these victims are very young children. The death toll would ultimately rise to 23. From Stanford Magazine, December 2015, in a story called The Big Game Disaster of 1900 by Sam Scott. 3 years after the roof collapsed, 28-year-old Thomas Pedler passed away after enduring spinal surgery, paralysis, and the amputation of both legs. His demise marked the 23rd and last death resulting from the disaster, 15 of which being children that died before their 18th birthday. Scott also tells us in the story that today, currently, there's little to no record of the event even taking place. It's even hard to find graves. Many of the 23 victims were placed in San Francisco cemeteries that were soon abandoned due to regulations to rid the city of graveyards. And even those like Pedler and Valencia, whose bodies were placed in Holy Cross Catholic Cemetery south of the city, have no headstones. Their families likely couldn't afford them. There are many horrible things in this story beyond the story itself. The verdict is shocking to our modern sensibilities. That the building should have been better constructed. That the sports reporting included no mention of the accident and the deaths. Or that this entire story is largely forgotten by history. More than a century after it happened, the Thanksgiving Day big game catastrophe remains the deadliest sporting disaster in American history, yet one almost utterly forgotten in college football history, especially by Stanford, Cal, and the city of San Francisco.